Hi, everyone. We're just going to give it maybe another minute or so to give other friends some time to arrive. But in the meantime, I'm always so curious to see who has found their way to our webinars. So if you want to hop in the chat, just make sure you select everyone, because if you select just host and panelist, only some of us will be able to see it. But if you select everyone, let us know where you're coming from, what state, what country, what organization, what school. Love to see who's here. Hey, Montana. Welcome. Mexico. Oh, we got some of our Good Grief facilitators. I see lots of familiar names here. Wisconsin, Maine, Northern Virginia. Adventure cycling. Florida, Morristown. I see some Good Grief employees mixed in here. Wonderful. All of our friends near and far, we are so happy to have you here with us on this beautiful day here in New Jersey. I don't know about all these other parts of the world right now, but it is sunny. It's not too hot. So we're really a great day. But welcome. I am Evelyn Moon. I'm Director of Education here at Good Grief. I am coming to you live from our Princeton, New Jersey Center. I'm currently in our Teen Center. And I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to spend time with you today. And I'm sending immense gratitude to each and every one of you for your attention, for your presence. And I'm also so grateful for our wonderful facilitator, who I'll introduce in just a moment. So today's session is part of our Good Grief Schools webinar series, and we're coming to almost a close on this year's. In June, we will have our final webinar of the 2021-2022 school year. Believe it or not, it is coming. But these Good Grief School webinars, we want to bring you content, we want to bring you experts, and we want to bring you information as a way to extend the work that we do outside of our centers and into the virtual space. We want to give you things to think about. We want to give you tools. I mean, anything and everything that you could need. And anyone who's here live will receive a certificate of attendance that'll go out within the next 48 hours with our survey, and also the link to register for our last webinar of the season. So for those of you who are maybe attending your very first Good Grief event, we are a nonprofit organization. We've been around in New Jersey since 2004, and our mission is to build resilience in children, strengthen families, and empower communities to grow from loss and adversity. So for most of our history, we've been providing completely free and unlimited peer support programs to grieving children and families in our 2 centers here in New Jersey. But in recent years, we've been growing with our education advocacy. We've been providing training and curriculum and resources to schools, hospitals and healthcare settings, the funeral industry, corporations, other nonprofits, really anywhere that we can empower communities with the tools that they need to build resilience and support the needs of grieving children and families. Just a big picture view of some of the work that we do. If you are ever interested, please reach out if you want to know about our nights of support. Our summer camp is coming up in August. We do lots of PD and parent and caregiver sessions as well. But enough about us. I want to introduce you to our wonderful presenter today. We have Dr. Kelly Moore. She is a licensed clinical psychologist in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. She has a clinical specialty in the treatment of anxiety, trauma, and perinatal disorders in youth and adults. She's worked in efforts to disseminate evidence-based treatments and develop trauma-focused programs in community mental health, so in Philadelphia and New Jersey. She's worked on identifying facilitators and overcoming barriers to implementation of evidence-informed practice and implementing trauma-informed care with multidisciplinary teams. She's also a national trainer in attachment, regulation, and competency framework of treating complex trauma in young children and their caregivers. As you can see, she is the owner of More Wellness, LLC, the creator of the Well Family Spot blog, and she is director of the Center for Psychological Services at the Rutgers Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology. And we are just so grateful to have Dr. Kelly be part of our day today. So thank you and welcome, Dr. Kelly.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction and thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be with you all today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so I can get started. Um, I wanted to just mention to everyone, sort of strangely, I was doing great throughout this whole pandemic, and I thought, I was taking every precaution one could take, but I knew at some point I would have to face off with COVID, and this week was that week for me. It finally caught me. So I am not normally where I would be to present to you all. I usually am in my home office, but I'm isolating for the next few days. I've been isolating this week because I was tested positive for COVID. And so if you hear me sound a little congested, it's just because I'm kind of going through the process. If any of you have had COVID or know people who have had it, obviously, you know that it's sort of hard to know how fast you'll progress through it, but I definitely am feeling a little better today, but definitely pretty congested. So my apologies for sounding a little stuffy through the presentation. I just want to thank Evelyn again and the team at Good Grief for inviting me. And I'm really pleased to be talking about this particular topic, mainly because it's something I'm very passionate about, understanding how trauma affects children and adults, helping adults to heal from past trauma. And grief in particular has become a new interest of mine over the years, because I find that a lot of the work that I'm doing with individuals, particularly adolescents and adult women in the past few years, have been focused on understanding how grief and trauma commingle, and helping people to kind of go through the process of healing and understanding how to accept the difference in their life after having a loss of some kind. And so I'm very fortunate to work with some amazing clients, and just to be able to bear witness to and be a part of their healing journey is really humbling for me. And so I'm excited to talk with you all about that a little bit today. So before we get started, as Evelyn mentioned, I'm a trainer, and I actually do the work of a program that's called ARC. It's Attachment Regulation and Competency, and it's a framework that was created to help children and families heal from complex trauma, which is really thought of as when people are in environments where they're exposed to continuous stress and trauma. And so we call that complex trauma. And so one of the tenets of this program is to bookend your sessions with clients in talking about how their energy is feeling. And I really have embraced this concept over the years, because I find when you ask people how they're feeling, most of the time people will say, okay, or can't complain, or I'm good. They say whatever they think people want to hear, or they say something that requires very little explanation and won't result in a long kind of conversation. And so for now, I want you to just forget about how you're feeling in the moment. And instead, we talk about energy in this framework. And so the first thing people do is kind of check in with their bodies, themselves in the moment. I'm doing that as I'm talking to you. And we ask then, is your energy right now high energy, low energy, medium energy? And we ask the person to share. And there's no right or wrong answer. Obviously, it's literally just how your energy is in the moment. And you kind of define for yourself what that means. And then the third step of that is based on the energy level you have right now. Is it comfortable to you or uncomfortable? So right now, I would say my energy is pretty medium, and I am comfortable in spite of the fact that I'm pretty sick. I do feel comfortable talking with all of you. I at least am in a comfortable environment. Don't feel too uncomfortable right now. And then the next step in this energy check is asking yourself, how good is the fit between where your energy is right now and the task you have before you? So for the next, 45 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking to all of you. I'm going to be asking you to do some self-reflection. How good is that fit between what you're about to do for the next hour or so? How good is that fit between this task and where your energy is right now? And then finally, what do you feel like you have to do to get into a better fit if your energy doesn't feel like it's in a good fit for the task before you? The reason why I like this is because it really does help people to do some, introspection about, how they're feeling in the moment beyond just feeling happy or sad, or like these emotion words that we throw out a lot of the time. and really just also as a non-judgmental way to have people examine where their current state is, but also to give them the empowerment to be able to notice that they actually can do things to shift their energy. So on a Zoom call, we shift our energy around by turning on our camera, turning off our camera, by engaging in the chat or not engaging in the chat. So we do things to kind of make that fit feel more compatible. And so just check in with yourself and go through those steps. And I'm going to keep moving through my presentation, but just be aware of that as we're talking, because obviously, even when we're talking about traumatic grief or trauma or stress, we start thinking about our own traumas and grieving processes and stress. And so knowing that, I want everyone to be aware of what those triggers might be so that you can manage that as we're talking, in case you are in fact triggered at all during this meeting. So my plan is to talk a little bit about trauma and traumatic grief, what those symptoms are, what it looks like, to talk about and validate different forms of loss that we may encounter when we're working with people in the community, to look at how concretely anxiety and traumatic stress shows up for people, and also how that's different based on developmental stage in life. So younger children versus middle schooler, high schoolers, adults, and even, differences that might even be related to like cultural significance as well. And also how to tap into our own resilience to have a new lens for coping. And then I'll end with a summary and be able to answer some questions at the end. So I just want to tell my story in coming into this work. This woman to the right, this young, beautiful woman, in my opinion, is my mother. Her name was Diana. And in 2015, and actually a few years prior to 2015, my mom had been dealing with a cancer diagnosis. It kept coming back. She really did, fight very hard to kind of combat that with her doctors. And in 2015, on my birthday, she actually passed away. And so it's been about 7 years, right? Yes, almost about 7 years since she passed away. And that was just a very jarring experience for a lot of different reasons. One, she was very young, 61 years old. It was a couple of weeks before my sister's wedding, so there was also a lot happening. It just felt like sort of a cluster of like, oh my gosh, kind of feeling. Even though to some extent I knew that, the cancer was, very difficult for her to continue to fight against. And, she was ready to kind of, move forward and transition, had really come to peace with it. I don't think any of us did. And this picture on the left is actually a picture of my younger sisters all the way to the right, my grandmother, who is my mom's mom, my mom and I at my mom's 60th surprise birthday party. And this is just a fun memory I have of my mom. It was the first time she ever had a surprise party. And so she was really excited. It was a whole New York theme. My mom's from Brooklyn. And so we had a whole Brooklyn theme party, and it was so much fun. A lot of family came out. And so I really love this picture of all of us together. My grandmother passed away a couple of years after that, sometime in the fall. And so I really kind of have been like learning how to live without, almost like what feels like a real big part of my family pie, if you will. That gap has been there. And so having been a trauma therapist all these years before then, I really had to tap into my own skill set, practicing what I've been preaching for so long, seeking my own therapy to deal with grief. And so this is a lot of what you're hearing today. It's really also me reinforcing these skills for myself, but also reminding myself of like how this is a daily thing that I have to work on and live through, because as we all know, grief is something that once it kind of comes into your life, it's kind of hanging out and walking alongside you or right behind you for a lot of the time that you have remaining, right? So it's like, it's always kind of there. It may show up in different ways, but it's kind of hanging out, and learning how to live with that is really part of the journey of healing. So when I talk about trauma, I'm not talking about physical injury, but the way we think about psychological trauma is these three components. So one, some event that results in an overwhelming loss of control over your own physical or psychological safety, and it causes a lot of distress. In the DSM, which is like the diagnostic manual that therapists may use, trauma is defined in very broad categories and often doesn't capture some other aspects of trauma. So it's not like, it has things like a natural disaster or being assaulted or something like that, but it doesn't include other types of trauma like a separation or a divorce or even the death of a loved one. That's captured under like bereavement. It's not really captured as a trauma. And I think that that's a mistake, that the DSM continues to leave out things that actually do result in the same kind of traumatic impact as the results we see sometimes for post-traumatic stress disorder. We just don't classify it as that for a lot of different reasons. In some ways it's good, in that we don't pathologize people experiencing grief over things that they ought to experience grief from. But for some people, the prolonged grief or complicated grief really does fall into a category that just is not captured by our current diagnostic systems. The other component of trauma is that significant loss of like feeling vulnerable, that loss of control, and sometimes even having a sense of personal shame and guilt, which I'll talk about a little bit. This is such a big part of grief. A lot of times we hear people talk about feeling guilty about something that they did or didn't do or said or didn't say to the person that they lost. And that loss of control, that feeling of like, this is a forever situation that I've lost this person, that finality is not something that human beings are always the best at coping with, because we want to feel like there's solutions to our problems. And usually that does not include accepting sort of harsh truths. And so sometimes when we're in the role of a supportive role or a helper or a therapist or a teacher or whatever, part of our role is helping people get to a place where they can manage that kind of finality feeling. And then when we've experienced a lot of trauma or a sense of tragic loss, there's this loss of trust that we might have in others, the world, or even our own selves. We might have trouble making decisions, and then it might affect other behavioral aspects of our lives, which is concentration and sleep and mood and things like that. So trauma kind of falls into these three aspects of an experience capture what we think about as like a psychological trauma. Traumatic grief is really that element that has to do with a loss that is a death or a significant rupture to a relationship that is irreparable. And so traumatic grief is something that follows that loss. And usually we think of traumatic grief as linked to some kind of loss that's more sudden or tragic in nature. So if someone dies by suicide or a homicide, or, after like an illness that really sort of took a rapid onset, those kinds of things are really thought of as far as when we think about traumatic grief reactions, we usually link it to those kinds of losses. So it's normal grief symptoms plus post-traumatic symptoms. And what's different about that is that sometimes people that have post-traumatic stress really struggle with being able to turn off their fear response. So a lot of things cause them to go into fight or flight or freeze mode. And there's lots of like biological changes that happen when people experience significant traumatic loss or traumatic experiences. And without any intervention or without a buffer of safety or someone who feels safe, that's when we see symptoms of PTSD. So when there is a loss, that's a death of some kind, plus these PTSD-like symptoms, that's what we think of with traumatic grief. There also might be, in regards to traumatic grief, an overestimation of threat or having significant anxiety about the future. So a lot of anxiety-like symptoms, panic attacks, nightmares, intrusive thoughts, and having a lot of like fear-based response. Blow my nose really quick. Okay. And so fear-based responses are things like with kids, you might see this where there's fear about dying, that death feels more proximal, like it's more close to you because of a result of someone close to you dying. depression symptoms too, those feelings of hopelessness and loneliness that extend beyond what we would think of a typical bereavement period. Not that there is such a thing, but if we had to quantify these things, think about 6 months, a year out, if people are still having the same significant responses they had as the time the loss actually happened, we would say that that's an example of like prolonged or traumatic grief. And as I've been talking, I mentioned that there are different types of grief experiences. So death of a loved one after an illness is one, right? But also the sudden loss of a loved one, a dying by suicide. And that's something that I think what makes that sometimes a complicated one is when people die by different means. I think that the general public reacts differently to the families that have been impacted. And so maybe there's not as much sympathy, or there's more endorsement of sympathy or less support around anger or frustration or the mixed emotions that come with loss when the loss is of a different nature. So a suicide loss may be viewed and thought of differently and even talked about differently within a family or community. Versus if someone dies after being sick, or if someone dies in a tragic accident of some kind, how sudden something is versus how expected something is also changes that. So there's all these different like nuances to how people process grief. When you think about how we even think about what we've said or done with that person that we've lost, that all plays a part in like how frustrated or how upsetting or how traumatized we are about that loss. And the one kind of grief that I don't hear people talk about a lot, but I know in my practice, I see this a lot, is a divorce, an ending of a long-term relationship or betrayal, and how that affects the reactions of the children, the families, the communities that have to change, the friendships that have to change as a result of a divorce or the ending of a long-term relationship of some kind of partnership or some type of a betrayal by someone that you trusted. So people will often feel grief responses that are very similar to how they would feel about a death, because it is kind of like a death, right? A death of something that you trusted and felt was going to be there for a while, and now it's not happening anymore. And again, each of these different types of grief experiences are going to be looked at differently by the people around you, and may or may not be supported by the people around you based on the loss. And even like we hear about the way people tell people to move on and like, get over things. Well, a lot of that is contingent on their perception about what they believe are the norms of how long someone should be upset about it. And so people don't always feel like they have a lot of support, depending on these factors about who's around them and how people are helping to support them or not during the process of grieving. And while I'm talking, feel free to put questions or comments in the chat. We'll definitely run back to them at the end to go back over them. So the Mayo Clinic has this really great site that kind of talks about symptoms of complicated grief. I also want to add that the COVID pandemic has created culturally, if we think about culture broadly beyond just like race, ethnicity, religion, culture is also generation, like when you were born, when you were growing up. So if you're a child of the 80s, growing up in the 80s, like me, 80s and 90s, there's a cultural, like you have a cohort that has a culture around certain things that happened during those time periods. So if you are a child or a teen that was in your formative years from March 2020 to about now and going forward, these kids are going to be qualitatively different in their developmental experience because of the experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so many people had losses during this pandemic that are so specific to this time that it's easy for them to feel very much alone. Even though we know other people have gone through things, for a lot of people that had lost during the pandemic, they had family members that were in the hospital. They were not allowed to go and do some of those last moments with that relative. We have people that we've seen an uptick in suicide deaths during the pandemic. again, just the uniqueness of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the mental health and wellness of people, and just the inability for people to do the normal rites of passages around sort of the closure you get when someone dies, like a funeral where everyone can attend. A lot of people were, not able to do that. And so we may see more of the impact of complicated grief in the coming years, because we know that without intervention, these problems can persist. And so the Mayo Clinic has this great website sheet or one of the pages on the website that talks about this kind of issue, symptoms of complicated grief. And it has here all the different components, some of which I've already talked about, but intense sorrow and pain, again, that doesn't seem to loosen, doesn't seem to ever have like a lightened moment where there's days where they feel okay, and then there's days where they feel upset. But it just is this persistent sorrow that they're feeling all the time that just interferes with their ability to live their lives in a way that even feels normal again. Constant rumination about and focus on the loved one's death. So this is maybe replaying things in your mind over and over again, trying to remember details, worried about losing details, to the point that you're obsessing over it, and it's getting, again, interfering with your way of life. Inability to accept the loved one's death. And that can show up and be illustrated in a lot of different ways. Inability to accept a loved one's death. Numbness, detachment, or bitterness over the death. So feeling anger, not wanting to talk about it, sort of almost trying to do somewhat of an erasure, like minimizing the impact of the death on your life. So it's like these two extremes here, being sort of overwhelmingly impacted, and then also trying not to feel any impact whatsoever, which actually can keep people stuck. Loss of meaning or purpose in life, inability to enjoy your life or carry on with normal activities, belief that you caused it or somehow could have prevented it, feeling despondent or wishing you died along with that loved one that you lost. So these are just examples, and I'm sure for all that are on this call, you obviously do have a passion for working with folks and processing and dealing with your own experiences and helping others to cope with theirs. So I'm sure this is not anything that you haven't heard of or seen before. And I think what makes this considered complicated grief is that persistent long-term nature of these kinds of symptoms, where there doesn't seem to be any real relief that is sustainable for the person that is experiencing this kind of loss. And so I hope you can see my whole slide, because I can see that part of my slide is a little covered up. But so that long-term trauma, stress, and anxiety that comes along with grieving can show up in a lot of different ways. A lot of times people want to say that things don't bother them, or, oh, I can deal with it, I can handle it. But the thing about stress is it's going to find a way out. It's going to find a way out somehow. And it shows up in these 4 different components of our lives. So physically, physically is where you see a lot of young people show signs of stress and depression and traumatic responses. Because especially for younger kids that don't have a lot of the verbal skills to tell you how they're feeling inside, they will show you, and it'll show up in these physical symptoms. A lot of these kids will talk about having stomach aches and headaches. They're not sleeping well. There's a lot of lethargy, just general kind of malaise, like not being their normal energetic selves, having a hard time getting the energy to do the things they would normally do for kids that are developmentally the same age as them. So with younger kids, we really do try to pay more attention to that impact of trauma and loss, how it shows up physically for them, and behaviorally. So behaviorally, and this is true for young ones, but also adults, is rigidity. So rigidity is like not so much like them being like difficult on purpose, but it's almost like trying to create so much control that they seem rigid. They're not able to like handle flexibility. And part of that is because, remember, death and loss and trauma is unpredictable in nature, as I talked about. And so much of what people may do to try to counter that after the fact to cope is to try to make things as stringent and predictable as possible as a means of like feeling more in control of things. So they become very rigid. Things have to be a certain way. They don't like to not know what's going on. They may do a lot of reassurance seeking. So asking a lot of questions, asking for a lot of verification of information, just to be certain. There's a need to just feel more certain about things. For younger kids, we also think about clingy behaviors too, not being comfortable with parents going out as much, maybe regressing where they used to be able to go to bed at night independently and now they can't, or clinging to friends, calling a lot on the phone, texting a lot to make sure you're okay. Maybe mood disturbance where there's suddenly a lot of outbursts, either crying spells and or anger because they can't be in control of something. And again, this is like noticing something different. So sometimes this is like people are just rigid from the jump, from the beginning. They've always been rigid and controlling. This is when, you have people that were not like that pre-trauma or traumatic loss. And now they are like that as a means of like, because we're always trying to heal. That's the beauty of our human experience, is that our brains are always trying to tap into something to keep us resilient, keep us going, keep us strong. It's just that the strategies aren't always the most healthy, but we're always trying to get back to some kind of equilibrium. And so sometimes the pendulum just swings a little too far when we've had something that's knocked us completely the other way, like a traumatic loss. One of the ones that I feel like I deal with a lot in therapy is avoidance. So this is true for across the board, from as young as 3 and 4 year olds I've worked with, all the way up to, people in their 70s and up that I've worked with. Avoidance is such a big part of the process of grief and loss and traumatic stress healing procedures. And part of it is that people will avoid things thinking that it's helpful to them. So avoiding clearing out the items of a person once they've passed away, avoiding the corner where the store is that person used to love, or avoiding anything that reminds them about the person as much as possible. And that's because in the short term, avoidance is a really helpful strategy. In the moment, if we avoid, it helps us to calm down. It helps us to not have to think about that person, so we don't get upset if we have something to do. We don't want to have to think about it. But the downside is that it's not a long-term fix. And we don't want that to be the go-to escape hatch we pull when we're feeling memories or reminders about that experience that happened or that person that we lost, because that pattern is a recipe for us to never really go through a healing process. Emotional experiences that people report is having a lot of fear. My dad talks about this a lot because he's the men on his side of the family, many of them passed away before the age of 54. And so he always talks about how now that he's 70, he's always like, any year I got past 54 was like a gimme, like, yay, I got there. So he spent a lot of his younger adult life thinking about that 54, like what's going to happen. So that fear is there. Now, it's not irrational if you think about it. If many of the men in your family passed away at this certain age, it's kind of makes sense that you might be thinking, is that going to happen to me too? But again, we're always thinking about it from the sense of how much does it then interfere and change the person's quality of life? That's the key to identifying whether or not something's a problematic thought process or a problematic emotion versus one that kind of makes sense and the person has figured out how to live with that and have a fulfilling life where they can enjoy the things they want to enjoy. And so anger, guilt, shame are other aspects of emotions that come up a lot with trauma and traumatic loss. And from a spiritual perspective, they may question their faith. If you are from a family that is very religious, where, the belief is that, your pastor, your priests, or your rabbi, or whoever is your, the person you can go to and they'll pray for you and, God will heal, or whatever your higher power is will heal. And then the person doesn't, get healed and they die from that illness. That could shake up someone's faith. That could make people feel, well, what was I praying for? So you see people like question that. They may have a loss of hope. They may even question themselves, like, was I doing the right thing by, praying about this? Should I have done other things? And maybe just feeling less connected to their spiritual beliefs as a result of that. I want to say that in the immediate time of loss after something happens, this is all very normal. Like, I would think it would be odd if people didn't have those thoughts. But the idea is that over time, you would expect that to repair. And that all comes into what helps that to repair is the impact of, the people in your life and how the people in your life know how to respond to things. So the way that this affects our lives, as I said, is that avoidance, sometimes intrusive thoughts, shame and guilt, blunted emotions, where as people are starting to heal, sometimes they almost stop themselves in their tracks, where if they start to feel happy, they're like feeling bad that they feel happy, or feeling bad that they're laughing and having a good time. Like, how could you be having fun when you've experienced this loss of your mom? Like, how dare you laugh and have fun? Or even having cognitive or behavioral changes. Sometimes we see when people have experienced a lot of traumatic loss and they're dealing with grief, they start to kind of say, well, life is kind of like, going to hand me any kind of random curveball. So I'm just going to live like there's no tomorrow. And sometimes that can go too far too, where you see people engage in reckless behaviors. You hear adolescents talk about, well, who cares if I'm going to die? So-and-so died, and they were just sitting around and they were totally healthy and then died from this. Well, I'm going to smoke, I'm going to drink, I'm going to do, like, who cares? I'm just going to live my life. And that whole, like, you only live once kind of mantra being adopted. And so again, like the problem with that is that these are sort of bandages on very deep wounds that have to be addressed, because if not, then people are embracing maladaptive patterns of thinking and behaving that in the long run don't actually help them to heal from anything. And so that loss of control and personal safety and predictability and trust is what people are often grabbing for. If I could take all of those different symptoms and put them in buckets, usually it's about one of these things. And so in our work and support of people that are going through this, and then the work we do with ourselves, it should be in service of restoring these things, restoring a sense of control, restoring a sense of safety, restoring a feeling of life can be predictable. And where it is predictable is where I'm going to focus my efforts, because in many ways, life is highly unpredictable, but we lived with that all the time before we suffered a loss. We've lived with unpredictability before, and we live with it every day to some extent. It's just that where is our focus? Right? Where are we looking every day at where we have more control? And the more we have that sense, and the more we can replicate that feeling of calm each day, it builds back trust in ourselves and others in the world that we might have lost as a result of what has happened to us. So I'm just watching my time, making sure I don't go too long. So the truth is, we all want certainty, but we sometimes don't realize where we can and can't get it. So I always tell my clients to talk about this, like to make a bucket of things, like tell me all the things that are concerning you right now, all the thoughts that are upsetting you right now, and let's put them into buckets. Where do you have control? And this little wheel is looking at these areas of like general wellness. There's a whole wellness recovery model that's really wonderful. I don't have time to talk about it, but it's a wellness model that looks at all these different components of our lives that we look at when we think about wellness. And so where do we have the most control? That's where we want to focus our energy on. And so I don't have control over what other people say to me. So for example, one of the things after my mom died that I realized people say a lot, and they have the best of intentions, is they say, everything happens for a reason. Or they say things like, you're the only, what doesn't kill you. I think it's like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger is the phrase I heard a lot. And for the life of me, I just did not understand why people thought that would be helpful for me to hear. But I know they meant well. But I don't have control over, like, what other people say. If people say those things, they mean well, and I can just kind of nod and whatever. But me getting angry with them was not going to be beneficial or helpful in any way. And so I ask people to think about, where do you have control in your life? And then check in with yourself. Well, what feels certain right now? So there's a couple of things that we know, like we can look at, well, I know what I'm going to have for dinner tomorrow. Like, that doesn't feel like a big deal, but that is something you can be certain of. So this is not like, people tend to want to have like this, like, sort of epiphany of like healing happen. And it's like the skies open up and the flowers bloom. That's not normal life. Sometimes our predictability is in the small things that happen every day. So it's that, I know I'm going to go to work tomorrow, so I know every day I'm probably going to go to work because I'm not someone who skips out on work. Also asking themselves, what's been the hardest thing about the loss? What is a time in your life where you were certain that you weren't going to be able to get through something, but you did? People have often overcome things in their life, and they don't give themselves any credit for that. And so sometimes we think things are going to be so hard and we're never going to get through it, but then we do. Like, I can think about myself now. Back then, I really was like, how is my sister going to get married? Like, she can't get married now. Like, she can't have a wedding. But it was like, no, my mom would really like come and haunt us forever if we delayed this wedding that has been planned for so long. And so together as a family, we went forward with the wedding, and it was beautiful. It was a beautiful, beautiful wedding. But at the time I was like, well, I'm not going to be able to make it through the day. I'm not going to be able to do it. And then I did it. And so with every day, I have a friend who told me that her mom always said, you always step out on your right foot. And I always thought that was a really cute saying. But every day I decided, like, I'm going to step out on my right foot. And if I have a bad day, then I'll start over the next day on my right foot. And I'll keep putting that right foot forward. And so think about all the times in life that you remember trying to do something that was really hard and you thought you wouldn't be able to do it, and you did it. Also asking yourself, what types of changes have been the hardest to accept since the loss? And what of those changes can I change? What of those changes can I do? Whether it's, remembering how to make a food that person used to make, or remembering the things that person taught you, or the fun times you had together. What's been hard, and can you still do some of those things in almost in honor of the person, as opposed to as it being a bad memory or making you feel distressed? And how do you cope with change in general? If you know that you're always someone who doesn't do well with change, from the mundane to the major, then you have to almost embrace the fact that this might take me a little while, but I'm going to get there, and keep telling yourself that until you do get there. And then the self-care piece that I'll close out with is so important. And self-care is like a topic that so many people are chatting about and talking about. But the truth is that I think with self-care, one of the things that I think gets missed is that it really isn't like having to go somewhere or pay money for it. Self-care is really about being able to find small things in the moment to regulate your energy. So it's really in the moment stuff that I talked about, like turning the camera on and off. I took a pause to blow my nose. That's self-care. I mean, we don't think about it like that. But self-care is anything you do to kind of continue to calibrate so that the energy you have is comfortable and matches the fit of the challenge before you in the moment. It's very in the moment mindfulness based. So Audre Lorde, who is a prolific writer. I love everything about what she's written. She writes about lots of different things, but this quote from her is one I use all the time, where she says, I've come to believe that caring for myself is not self-indulgent. Caring for myself is an act of survival. And she goes on to talk about it as like a revolutionary act. It's a political act to care for yourself, because so much of the world wants everybody to focus on everybody else. And so self-care is not just about what you do, but a real mindset of survival so you can maintain calm in the midst of stress. And so these pieces of self-care are to check in with yourself, as I said, like the energy check, and to anticipate your triggers, and accept that that is part of the healing process, that there are going to be triggers that are going to come your way that you couldn't have anticipated. Anticipate as much as you can, but be realistic about what you can and can't control. So you can't control the weather. You can't control, you know, whether or not someone is even possibly going to trigger you by saying something that to them feels very innocent, but is triggering for you. But you can control your response and how much you want to engage in a conversation about those things, and really focusing in on yourself and being aware of how your body changes when you are triggered. And then remembering to pause and embrace and accept and then move through the moment. Don't get stuck. And I think people often are suffering because they're stuck, and they have really high expectations of how they're quote unquote supposed to be. And there's just no rules. They get to write this book on their own of how they're going to process and grieve throughout the rest of their lives. And so this, going back to this energy check, this is such a big part of my day on a regular basis. And I have to sometimes do it throughout the day, especially around this time of year. We're going into Mother's Day. You know, Mother's Day is not all Hallmark cards for everybody. These commercials, although I'm seeing a little less this time of year than I normally do. But we see these Mother's Day commercials and everybody's like so happy. And, you know, these commercials now don't bring me the same energy it used to bring me when my mom was still here. And I have a wonderful mother-in-law, and, you know, I have mother figures, but it's not the same as, you know, my mom. And so I have to be aware of my energy for the next several days. And maybe a few days after that, you know, when my birthday comes, I have to do a check-in with my energy around them, because I share that day now with the day that my mom transitioned. So redefining what that is going to be for me based on my energy changes what I do from year to year. Some years it's like hasn't been an issue, and I've been able to be what I feel like is myself again. But then some years it's been really hard, or I'm good until like 9 p.m. that night, and I'm like, oh, it got me, you know. But kind of leaning into that, because the more we resist, the worse it feels. And then we start to feel like a failure because we couldn't, you know, be strong, whatever that means. But strength is really coming from the ability to kind of also give ourselves space to have a moment and move on. So I always say to people, if your energy was currency, money, what do you spend your energy on? And do you have buyer's remorse for the things you spent it on that you probably shouldn't have? So if your energy is really focused on doing things that build you up, build the people around you up that you care about, and not necessarily trying so hard to push yourself as far away from, you know, difficult feelings as possible, then we want to try to make sure we're spending our money in the right place, so to speak. And so the couple last things here before I stop for questions is having a realistic toolbox for your own self-preservation. And so this is something also coming out of that ARC framework, where they talk about in the moment crisis situations. So when you are triggered, first of all, what do you do before you enter into a stressful situation where you know you might be triggered? So for me, it might be Mother's Day. For you, it might be, or a person you're working with, it may be anytime that a birthday of a loved one comes up, that has passed away or something like that. But what are they doing before that to kind of manage that energy and stress level? And then what do they do during that time when it's stressful? What are they doing in the moment? Are they breathing? Are they drinking water, staying hydrated? Did they get a good night's sleep? These are things that cost you no money, but it's things that people forget are part of self-care. If you are dehydrated, you're not able to think straight. You're not able to give your brain all of what it needs to have that energy to help you cope. If you're not sleeping well, sleep hygiene is so critical to our ability to manage stress, because we're holding a lot of stress hormone in our body, and without sleep, we're not really able to regulate that. What about immediately after you're in the stressful situation? What are you doing to kind of pour back into yourself, to kind of reaffirm yourself, to give yourself a pat on the back for getting through it? And then what's your ongoing self-preservation practice? It may be going for a walk every day. It may be just opening up the window and looking outside for a little bit each day. I want people to really start thinking more small about what self-care means, because wellness in general is something, well, having wellness to me is not really about like a state of like, I'm healthy. Wellness is really about an ongoing practice where you're able to manage life's sort of curveballs, and you can absorb that impact, and you are able to recognize, okay, I need help, or I don't need help, or I need this, I need that. So wellness is not like the absence of stress. It's more about how you cope with stress that helps with your wellness. And then I just have some ideas here for people to think about, if the kinds of situations that typically could trigger more anxiety and stress, and how you could cope with that. So maybe limit watching the news, especially with all the COVID coverage that was happening. At one point, I just stopped watching the news because it was just very devastating to watch, knowing that I had known people that had died from COVID. Find a way to use your voice productively, talk to other people, use your words, write it down, keep a journal. Try to do things that build in predictability and less stress and more connection. So maybe guided meditation videos, watching old shows or films you used to love that you know a lot about, because a lot of times having that predictability helps to just calm anxiety. So watching those old episodes of The Office or Seinfeld or whatever can help people feel a little less stressed out for the moment. And remember the things that you loved and didn't love about the person that you may have lost. A lot of times when someone passes away, we put them on this pedestal, angelic pedestal, where they have like wings and halos, and we like forget all the times they really pissed us off, really hurt our feelings, really weren't always the nicest person. And it's not a betrayal to remember those things, because that helps to balance the distress that we might have when we think about them, because we have to remember people as whole people. By crystallizing them as sort of godlike figures, then it makes it a lot harder to grieve, get through that grieving process, because you're kind of like thinking about them as someone that ought to be worshiped forever, if that makes sense. So we don't want to get stuck in that role. So just a summary is to kind of recognize your comfort zone for anxiety and trauma and stress. And remember that you are resilient. We all have a measure of resilience, and all the coping skills we try to implement are to help augment our resilience when we're feeling really stuck. Focus on what you can control. Help the young people you work with. If you work with young people, understand they do have some control over things, and they can make decisions and not get stuck in the what if this happens, what if that happens, what if this happens to me, and just continue to live. Teach people how to lean into their feelings and move through them, as opposed to trying to suppress them. That's not what we want. And then get help if you need it, and reevaluate your support system. There's some friends that are great for talking about grief. I know I have friends I can call and literally just cry, and they can totally contain that and hold that. And some friends that are like, don't cry, it's okay, everything's fine, everything happens for a reason. Great friends, not the friends for that part of my experience as a human being. And that's okay. But just being able to evaluate that and make those correct connections. So this is just another like kind of summary slide of what I just said. So I won't repeat all of that, because I do want to offer people a chance to ask some questions. And I just wanted to thank you all for inviting me. Sorry that I'm not in my location I want to be in to do this, but I hope that this was helpful, and I'm happy to stop sharing and answer questions if there are any.
I think we had a few in the chat and then some in the Q&A.
Okay.
I see in the chat, Melody asked about the reassurance seeking and the clinging behaviors, especially with moms, and curious, and this might even be for the whole group, but curious what others are doing to help their young people navigate this, in addition to doing everything to make the home safe and welcoming. So she's wondering, what are those simple things?
Sorry. So I don't know if others in the group want to respond to this, because it looks like it was a question also, like you said, to the general group. So in my normal day job, I am a person who does a lot of exposure therapy work. And so the idea of clingy, reassurance seeking behaviors, my recommendation to parents is always to not give in. And it's very hard to do that to our children when they are clamoring for us to do that for them. But I think that by giving in, you end up reinforcing. So if kids are being clingy, it's often because they're fearful that something is going to happen, right? And so if we then decide not to go out or take them with us, or not let them or not answer that question, if we decide to give into that, it almost like reinforces for them that that's what, in order for them to feel safe, this is what they need to hear, or this is what needs to happen. When in fact, most of the time, if you leave your house, you're coming home. Most of the time, if they don't know exactly when things are going to happen, they will be okay. And so by choosing not to give in to that urge to reassure, or that urge to allow them to be clingy or sleep in your bed or whatever, you almost will help them to build a tolerance for not knowing. And that's really just a helpful skill for humans in general. We have to be tolerant of not knowing the answers.
Thank you. And I see a thank you in the chat for acknowledging the struggles over Mother's Day, because that can be very difficult. More appreciation to help with the people that they work with, their own practices, lots of appreciation in the chat. And let me look at the Q&As I see. Let's see, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts to speak to regarding similarities and challenges of grief from sudden ambiguous loss, such as from a family member sustaining a severe brain injury and living, but in a minimally conscious, non-responsive state.
I think it's very similar. I think it's the same kind of grief response. And I think what complicates it is that other people that we often are relying on for support may not always understand that it's very similar to the grief of losing someone in the form of like death, right? And so if someone suffers a traumatic brain injury, they're not the same person they were before. I think the people in our lives don't know how to respond to that. So they may say things like, well, at least you still have them. It's like, but that's not the point, right? It's still a loss. It's still a significant loss for me of what this person once was and how they were in my life and how I can be in their life. And so I think the parallels are the same. And that's the beauty of, I think, the work I do as a psychologist. I find that people can have anxiety, and their form of anxiety or distress can be very different, but the skills are the skills. And so the skills work across a lot of different issues. That idea of, trying not to avoid, being vocal when you feel like someone doesn't get it, stating boundaries, what your needs are. I feel like that those are the ways that I think still work regardless of the form of loss or challenge. Those skills apply across the board, I think, for a lot of people's experiences.
Thank you. I see there's another question in the Q&A, very specific question. So, but it's asking, how worried should you be if a teenager doesn't show symptoms of complicated grief like this? So after they've experienced an extremely traumatic and sudden death, the asker recognizes it in themselves and says that their teen says he's okay. But I guess he hasn't gotten to that point yet after 2 years. I guess she's trying to gauge the level of concern here.
Yeah, I saw someone ask about me putting up the slide to the last second to last.
Yes, yes.
I'll put that up while I'm answering this question. So I want to just say too, just like with trauma, where two people can be in the exact same traumatic experience, and one person develops PTSD and the other person is sort of off for a few months, and then it seems to be quote unquote back to themselves and back to normal. That is true for death as well, like the loss of a loved one. There are some people that will not experience complicated grief, even when all signs point to it would be totally normal for them to have a lot of grief and a lot of traumatic symptoms after the fact. So I think that it's a wait and see thing, because sometimes there is this delayed For kids in particular, teenagers and kids, I find that they are very resilient compared to adults, which is like what we've seen with the pandemic, is that, the kids have been in general very resilient about the whole thing because they've had no choice. Like so much of their lives are sort of like predicated by what adults tell them to do, that they haven't had much of a choice. They go to school when they're supposed to go to school. They wear their mask when they're supposed to wear a mask. And they don't, they may have like internal thoughts about it, but so much of their lives are being like sort of told what to do by others, older people, that you'd be surprised how resilient they can be. It doesn't mean they're not impacted though. So I think that as long as they know that there's someone that eventually they can talk to that is open and able to hear if they are experiencing pain and stress as a result of that loss, then it comes out when it comes out. But it's possible that the life of a teenager is so busy and, and so distractible from having to sit with grief that we may see a delayed impact. That's very possible. But it's also possible that they are going through it and managing it and they're doing okay. So I don't want to take away from the fact that some people do recover faster than others. And we don't really know the reasons why. One of the reasons why we think it does happen for people with trauma is that people that avoid less tend to recover faster. So that may be something going on there too.
Yeah, all really great points. Thank you. And thanks for putting that slide back up, your entire slide deck. It looks like it's been a big hit with this group.
I'm happy to print or PDF it like a handout version, and I can send that to you.
Wonderful. Yes. So we have also recorded this session and we will be putting it up on YouTube. So it will be available as a resource. Let me just share my screen over here very quickly. So we have our Good Grief resource pages. There's lots of handouts and advocacy videos. That's where you'll find a lot of our events on our website. You can always contact me as well. I'm Evelyn with 2 N's at good-grief.org. This is our final webinar for this school year. So we will have Mandy Zucker talking about young adult grief. So how do we support our young people as they transition into essentially the beginning of adulthood, which I think is really relevant in June with so many of our young people starting to graduate, go on to work, to school, internships, whatever it is, how do we continue to support them? And like I said, everyone who has attended today will receive a certificate of attendance. I can also send along that PDF from Dr. Kelly, but I just want to say thank you to everyone for your time, for your attention. Thank you, Dr. Kelly, for being part of our Good Grief community. We appreciate you so much. And I really hope that you feel better very, very quickly.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I hope everyone takes care and has a great start to the summer.